Hello again. Having discussed a bit some of the theoretical disputes and advances in studying class in political sociology, I want to move now to the area that is particularly of interest to people in this program, in studies of the so-called CEAS region. By and large, the world that's structured by having had regimes that legitimize themselves under the ideology of socialism and the post-socialist state, and talk about some of the unique features of class and the political sociology of those states. So let's begin first by talking about the ways in which state socialist regimes emerged. And I think here it's important to take into account that the prediction that was offered by Marx that the working class would become conscious of itself and its interest and rise up and overthrow a fully developed bourgeois capitalist state, this did not happen anywhere. There was no communist revolution in the world of the type that Marx predicted. And he predicted, in fact, when he made his predictions, that the first revolutions would come in states where capitalism was most developed at the time. Those states were Germany and Great Britain. Instead, it was other factors that led to the establishment of state socialist regimes. Both the First and the Second World Wars. And what you saw, in fact, was regimes coming to power with the Communist Party in coalition with other allies, many of whom were set aside after they came to power. And you saw state socialist regimes coming to power with a social profile that had largely rural populations that did not have a large urban working class. And so these regimes had to improvise in creating state socialism, and they did it in a way, whether they followed the Soviet model or not, that involved rapid industrialization and urbanization, a high degree of centralization of both political and economic life, a goal of transforming social relations, and they justified themselves according to a set of ideas that argued that the past was relatively unimportant, that what they were setting into motion was a new historical period. And so they made great leaps forward. They talked about renewal of the society, of starting over, and so on. What did these regimes look like? Well, Marxist ideology was at the core of the justification of the regimes and of their culture and education. They attempted to create something that didn't exist, which was the basic condition for the revolution that Marx predicted, that is, an urban working class, a proletariat. And this was done through rapid urbanization and through industrialization, so that they attempted to create a working class according to their guidelines, and then to implement what they perceived as being the goals of Marxist theory. And one of the results of this, I mean, this was a result both of the inconsistency in the ideology and the conflict between the goals that these regimes proclaimed for themselves and the actual conditions in which they operated, with self-declared socialist states operating in a world economic system that was nonetheless dominated by capitalist states, were enormous gaps between theory and practice. Where they said that they were creating equality, they often created inequality. Where they said that workers were privileged, very often workers were disadvantaged. Where they said that they were eliminating classes, they frequently created new classes, especially classes of political functionaries and other officials in a dominant position over the working class. And there was an unusual form that politics took in these states, in which the dissatisfaction of members of these new working classes with the conditions under which they were living and working could be directed against the state using the same ideology that the state used to justify itself. So there was a unique and relatively unusual form of politics that emerged in these self-declared socialist states. One of the things that this meant is that during the period of the Cold War, regardless of which side of the East-West divide in Europe states were on, both sets of states experienced hierarchical social structures, and the inequalities that were created in state socialist regimes in part reproduced the inequalities that existed in the regimes that came before the Second World War, after which the majority of these regimes were established, but they were created again and reinforced through the policies of state socialism through the distribution of goods. For example, the distribution of housing, of access to places for holidays, in the reproduction of forms of employment opportunity, and so on. And at the same time, with an economy that was very often relatively rich in goods, but relatively poor in cash, sometimes the other way around, large parts of consumption took place independently of money, so that class difference depended not so much on how much money and property a person was able to own, very often they did not own any at all, but how much they had access to based on their position in the state hierarchy, in politics, and on informal networks that developed around politics. So this determined things like whether people were able to own automobiles, what kind of property they were able to live in, where they were able to go on holiday, whether they were able to ensure employment opportunities for their children, and so on. And a lot of these connections were informal. They depended not so much on the ability that people had in order to pay for things, but on their ability to exchange favors and to mobilize state institutions for interests. So what I mean to say by this is that despite the declared ideological goal of creating a classless society, state socialist regimes created a society with class divisions, but it created a society that had class divisions that had some very unique characteristics, some very unique contours, and some very unique dynamics that interacted with politics in an interesting way and probably contributed over time to delegitimizing these regimes, which eventually disappeared. When we want to talk about the post-socialist period, we can also talk about some ways in which hierarchies that were developed and reinforced during the socialist period are reproduced and reinforced by the privatization and redistribution of property in the post-socialist period. In the next segment, I'm going to suggest, we're calling this conclusions, but it's something more like general points and observations that you may want to think about as ways of tying together our discussion of class and inequality.